Hello, everybody. So I'm going to try to make this quick. This is a review. I'm also going to make sure, please, if you're not doing this right now, try to bother one of your parents or grandparents, brothers or sisters, or someone that you live with. And I want to do this with them because there's a couple times I'm going to ask you to say things out loud, and I want them to hear. Also, parents or guardians, if the student doesn't get it right, it's not something that you have to be worried about yet. We're still learning this. So hopefully help them through this, and students, do not be afraid to make a mistake right now. All right. So first thing that we talked about in class is that there's a couple of fractions that you really have to have memorized and know what the decimals mean. So right now I'm going to ask you, I'm going to put a problem, I'm going to put a fraction on the board, on the screen, like 1/2. And what you're going to do is you're going to tell whoever you're sitting with that means 0.5 or 0.50. Either one of those would work. Okay. So I'm going to give you a fraction. You just yell out to the person next to you. Okay. 1/4. What'd you say? Right. Hopefully they said 0.25. What about 3/4? Right. Hopefully you yelled out 0.75 because that's 3 of these. What about 2/3? What decimal is 2/3? Hopefully you heard them say 0.66. Actually, they should have really said 0.6 repeating because it really goes on forever. So that's my mistake. What about 1/3? Go ahead and yell out what you think 1/3 is as a decimal. Hopefully they said 0.3 repeating. They could have said 0.33333 or 0.3 forever. And we did a couple other ones that you really should have memorized. We talked about 1/5, and then once you know 1/5, you could do 2/5 and 3/5. So do you remember, yell out if you remember what 1/5 is. Hopefully they said 0.2 or 0.2. 0.2 would have been fine, but really 0 wholes and 2/10. So that means 2/5 would have been, go ahead, say it, 0.4. And 0.40 would have been totally okay. And 3/5 would have been 0.6 or 0.60, which is 6/10 or 60 hundredths. Okay? So next thing we talked about how a lot of times in real life, you're going to hear people say things like fractions. It happens mostly in sports. We talked about a sports example in class when someone does something out of a certain amount of time. So we used a basketball example in class. Let's use a baseball example. Let's say someone hits the ball twice, or I'm sorry, we'll say 2 times out of every 9. Okay, so that'd be the fraction 2/9. And we talked about how you can actually change that into a decimal. That's not one that you might have memorized, but you have to know, what does that mean? What decimal is 2 out of 9? So in class, we talked about the first thing, and this is where you're going to do one in a second in front of whoever you're watching this video with. But we talked about how you can take whatever number's on the top, you're taking that 2 and you're dividing it by 9. Right? And the number on the bottom, the denominator, always goes on the outside in long division. Right? So we said in class, just a reminder, that nothing times 9 gets you 2. So we're always going to change it to, we make it 20, but we put a decimal there so it stays technically as a 2. 2.0 is the same thing as 2. So now you're going to say 9, how many times does 9 go into 20? Well, I made a mistake because we did talk about in class that the reason why you added the 0.0 is because 9 does not go into 2. So we do have to add a 0, and we do have to add the decimal point. As soon as we put it down there, we bring it right up to the top. So now we're ready. Now, how many times does 9 go into 20? Well, 9 goes into 20. If you do the 9 times tables, eventually you would settle on that 9 times 2 is 18. So we know it goes in twice. 9 times 3 would be too much because that's 27. So once we divide, we multiply. 20 minus 18, we get a 2. So we've subtracted, and then we have to bring down because we don't want a remainder. So we're going to add a 0, and we're going to bring it down to the bottom. And you know what's funny is now we get another 20. So we're going to do 9 goes into 20 again. Well, 9 goes into 20. We already know it goes in 2 times. So I multiply and get 18. I get that same 2. Oh, so when I add a 0, what you're going to notice is that every single time you're going to get a remainder of 2. Well, what that's going to mean is that this decimal is going to actually repeat. So if you do something 2 out of 9 times, it's going to be 0.2. I mean, you're not going to sit there and write the twos all over. So you're just going to write it as 0.2 with a bar over it because that's the decimal. It's just a 0.2, and you can put a 0 in front, repeating. And that's how we change that fraction into a decimal. Sometimes you're not going to get it repeating, and sometimes you have to keep going until you get a remainder of 0. So right now, what I would love for you to do is, can you go ahead and can you find, and I want you to actually pause the video. And it's going to pause because I'm going to actually ask you to put in your answer. But can you try to figure out if you do something 5 out of 8 times? Now, this is not going to repeat. You're going to have to keep dividing until you get a remainder of 0. Can you figure out what decimal is 5 out of 8? So go ahead right now and show your parents or your guardians, grandparents, brothers, sisters, whoever. Okay. Cannot watch this video with one of your pets. That will not count, but please watch it with a human. And then go ahead and pause the video and do this. Okay? Now, once you got your answer, I'm going to, once you put your answer in, I will explain it right now on what you should have done, and I'll give you one more try after this. So 5 out of 8. Okay, remember the first thing you do is 5 divided by 8. Well, remember 8 doesn't go into 5, so it goes in 0 times, and I'm going to put a decimal 0 to make it 50, but it's really still 5. 5.0 is still 5. But we're gonna think of it as 50 because we put the decimal up here. 8 goes into 50. So if you think of your 8 times tables, 8 times 6 is 48. 8 times 7 is 56. 56 is too much because we got to get 50 or below. So it only goes in 6 times. And then when I multiply, I get 48. We did that over here. Remainder is 2. Well, remember, we can't stop there, so we have to add a 0, and we're going to bring it down. So now we got 8 goes into 20. 8 goes into 20 2 times, because 2 times 8 is 16. That's as close as you're going to get to 20. And when you subtract 20 minus 16, if you borrow, you're going to eventually get 4. Well, we're not done yet, so we're going to add another 0 and bring it down. And finally, 8 actually goes into 40. 8 times 5 is 40. So we know 8 goes into 45 times. And when I multiply and subtract, we get a remainder of 0, and there's nothing to bring down. So that's our answer. So if you do something 5 out of 8 times, you did it this, you could also represent it by doing it this amount of the time. Now, the last thing, let me give you one more just to do. And this one I want you to see, especially if you got that one wrong, I want you to do one more on your own. Can you please right now do 7 out of 8? If you do something 7 out of 8 times, if it rains 7 out of 8 days, what decimal does it rain? Okay, go ahead. And just in case you got that wrong, just here's what we would have done. 7, we would have added a 0.0. We would have said 8 goes into 7 0 times, but 8 goes into 70. It goes in 8 times because you get 64. When you subtract, you get a 6. Add a 0, bring it down. 8 goes into 60. We did in the last problem 7 times because you get 56. You get a remainder of 4. We add a 0, bring it down, and then 8 goes into 40 5 times. So 7 out of 8 is 0.875. And that's how you convert a fraction that you might not have memorized into a decimal. Right? Now, last thing I want to just remind some of you, and we did talk about this in class, this is nothing you're going to have to do. I just want to make sure you're going to call this out to a parent or guardian. Okay? If I know that percentages are easy to talk about because 0% is the lowest that can happen. And we did say in class, I did say that you could technically have over 100% depending on the situation. But for us, for right now, if you do something all the time, if it rains all the time, it rains 100%. So with percents, it's pretty easy to know what's the highest, what's the lowest. With decimals, it's a little bit more difficult, but just what would be the lowest number that would be a decimal? Okay, hopefully you said 0. Now call out, this is actually a little tricky because sometimes people say 100, but it's not 100. What decimal would be, Remember that if you have like half, it's 0.5. What decimal would technically be 100%? Can you yell that out? And you might not know, but it's 1. 1 or 1.0, a whole. If you have 1, it technically means you have 100% of it. And then there's decimals in between. So halfway between 0.5 and 1 whole is you can do something 0.75% of the time. So like anything down here, you'd be doing it more than half the time. Right? Anything below 0.5 is going to be less than half the time, like 0.25 or even 0.47. Those are decimals that would represent you doing it less than half the time. Okay. I hope that helped. I hope you got some good practice. And I hope you see the most important thing is even if you got it wrong, the idea is to start seeing where did you make your mistakes? Right? And then hopefully that will help you. We're going to take this information and we're going to actually use it to find tax and tip and percents off and things like that in class on Monday. But again, I hope that helped.